The morning sun painted the Atlantic Ocean in shades of gold and orange as Sarah Martinez guided her fishing boat through the calm waters off the Florida coast. At 34, she had the weathered hands of someone who knew the sea intimately, though most people would never guess the real reason behind her deep understanding of maritime operations. The gentle rocking of her 26-foot vessel, Silent Runner, felt like home to her now, a peaceful contrast to the chaos she had left behind 3 years ago. Sarah had purchased the boat with her military severance pay after retiring from active duty. It wasn't much to look at: white fiberglass hull with some rust stains, a small cabin that barely fit 2 people, and an engine that coughed more than it purred. But it was hers, and more importantly, it gave her the solitude she craved after spending over a decade in places where silence could mean the difference between life and death. She had been fishing since before dawn, her lines trailing behind the boat as she slowly trolled along the reef line about 12 miles offshore. The cooler beside her held 3 decent-sized grouper and a small yellowtail snapper. Not a bad morning's work. She was thinking about heading back to port when she noticed the white hull of a Coast Guard cutter approaching from the northeast. Sarah's military training kicked in automatically. She observed the vessel's approach pattern, noted the crew movements on deck, and calculated distance and time to intercept. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept you alive in hostile waters halfway around the world. The cutter was moving with purpose, not conducting a routine patrol. They were headed directly for her. She reduced her throttle and began reeling in her lines. Whatever this was about, she wanted to be ready. The Coast Guard vessel was a 47-foot motor lifeboat, the kind typically used for search and rescue operations, but also perfectly suited for law enforcement activities. As it drew closer, Sarah could see 4 crew members on deck, all wearing the standard blue uniforms and orange life vests. The cutter pulled alongside her boat, maintaining a professional distance. A young petty officer, probably in his early 20s with buzz-cut hair and serious eyes, stepped forward with a bullhorn. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Please prepare for inspection. Have your vessel documentation and fishing permits ready." Sarah nodded and moved to the small cabin to retrieve her paperwork. Everything was in order: boat registration, fishing license, safety equipment certificates. She had always been meticulous about following regulations, a trait that served her well both in her current civilian life and her previous career in places where breaking the wrong rule could get you killed. As the Coast Guard crew prepared to board her vessel, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The senior man on the cutter, a chief petty officer based on his insignia, was studying her boat with unusual intensity. His eyes weren't just conducting a routine safety check. He was examining every detail of her vessel as if he were looking for something specific. "Permission to come aboard," the young petty officer called out as he prepared to step onto her boat. "Granted," Sarah replied, extending a hand to help steady him as he crossed over. Behind him came the chief, a stocky man in his 40s with graying temples and the kind of alert gaze that came from years of experience on the water. The initial inspection seemed routine enough. They checked her life jackets, flares, fire extinguisher, and radio equipment. Everything was properly maintained and easily accessible. The young petty officer seemed satisfied, making notes on his clipboard as they went through the standard checklist. But the chief was different. He kept glancing at Sarah herself, rather than focusing solely on the boat's equipment. There was something in his expression that suggested he was trying to piece together a puzzle. "Mind if we take a look at your fish hold?" the chief asked, though it was clearly not really a question. "Not at all," Sarah responded, lifting the hatch to reveal her modest catch on ice. "Just some grouper and snapper, nothing oversized limits." The chief examined the fish briefly, then straightened up and looked directly at Sarah. "You fish these waters often?" "Few times a week. I live in Key Largo, so it's convenient." "And what do you do for work, if you don't mind me asking?" Sarah had expected this question eventually. Her boat was modest, but fishing gear was expensive, and she clearly had quality equipment. People often wondered how a woman living alone could afford to fish as much as she did. "I'm retired," she said simply. The chief raised an eyebrow. "Retired? You look pretty young for retirement." "Military retirement," Sarah clarified, hoping that would end the line of questioning. But instead of satisfying the chief's curiosity, this seemed to intensify his interest. He exchanged a quick glance with his subordinate, and Sarah noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The routine inspection was becoming something else entirely. "What branch?" the chief asked. "Navy," Sarah replied, which was technically true, though it didn't tell the whole story. The young petty officer had moved to the other side of her boat and was now examining her electronics more closely. Sarah had a standard fish finder, GPS unit, and marine radio. Nothing unusual for a serious angler. But she noticed he was paying particular attention to her antenna array and seemed puzzled by something. "Ma'am, this radio setup," the petty officer said, looking up from the console. "You've got some interesting modifications here." Sarah's blood pressure rose slightly. She had indeed modified her radio system, adding capabilities that weren't standard for civilian vessels. Nothing illegal, but definitely more sophisticated than what most recreational fishermen carried. "I like to stay in touch," she said carefully. The chief was now studying her with undisguised interest. "Navy, you said. What was your rate?" In Navy terminology, your rate was your job specialty. Sarah had to make a quick decision about how much truth to reveal. Too little, and they might become more suspicious. Too much, and she might raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Electronics technician," she said, which explained the radio modifications and was one of her official qualifications, though far from her primary specialty. "How long did you serve?" the chief continued. 12 years. "And you retired as what rank?" "Petty officer first class," Sarah replied, which was true as far as the paperwork was concerned, though her actual operational rank had been considerably higher in the units where she had spent most of her career. The chief nodded slowly, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in his head. Something wasn't adding up for him, though she wasn't sure exactly what was triggering his suspicions. The inspection continued for another 20 minutes. They checked her engine compartment, examined her tackle boxes, and even looked through her small cabin. Throughout it all, the chief maintained a professional demeanor, but Sarah could feel his scrutiny like a physical weight. Finally, they seemed to be wrapping up. The young petty officer was completing his paperwork when the chief's radio crackled to life. "Coast Guard Cutter Reliance. This is District 7 operations. Be advised we have a BOLO for a vessel matching your current inspection target. 34-foot white fishing boat with a single outboard, home port Key Largo." Sarah's heart sank. A BOLO meant be on the lookout. Law enforcement agencies used them when they were searching for specific vehicles or vessels. Someone had apparently reported her boat for something. The chief's expression hardened immediately. "Roger. Operations. Request details on the BOLO." Vessel reported as possibly involved in suspicious activity. Request thorough inspection and possible detainment, pending further investigation. Sarah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline, the same feeling she had experienced countless times when operations went sideways. But this wasn't some foreign harbor where she could rely on backup from her team. This was home waters, and she was alone. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to shut down your engine and prepare for a more detailed inspection," the chief said, his tone now completely official. "We've received reports about this vessel that require us to investigate further." "What kind of reports?" Sarah asked, though she kept her voice level despite the tension building in her chest. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the details, but I need you to remain calm and cooperate fully. This may take some time." Sarah nodded, but her mind was racing. Someone had reported her boat. But for what? She had been doing nothing but fishing, following all regulations, staying in legal waters. Unless someone had seen her modified electronics and jumped to conclusions about drug smuggling or some other illegal activity. The chief was back on his radio, requesting additional units and what sounded like a full maritime law enforcement response. This was escalating far beyond a routine inspection, and Sarah realized she might be in serious trouble. Even worse, if they decided to impound her boat for investigation, she could be tied up in legal proceedings for months. As the minutes ticked by, Sarah watched the Coast Guard crew transform from professional but routine inspectors into a focused law enforcement team. They were now treating her boat as a potential crime scene, and her as a potential criminal. The irony wasn't lost on her. After everything she had done in service to her country, in places and situations that would give most people nightmares, she was being treated as a threat in the very waters she had once helped protect. But Sarah Martinez hadn't survived 12 years in the world's most dangerous places by panicking under pressure. She forced herself to remain calm and think clearly. Whatever was happening here, she would deal with it the same way she had dealt with every other crisis in her career, by staying cool, thinking strategically, and waiting for the right moment to act. The question was, would that moment come before they decided to arrest her and confiscate her boat? 20 minutes after the first radio call, Sarah could see another Coast Guard vessel approaching from the south. This one was larger, a 50-foot response boat with a full crew complement. The situation was definitely escalating beyond anything she had anticipated when she left port that morning. The chief had been conducting what could only be described as an intensive search of her boat. He had gone through every compartment, examined every piece of equipment, and even checked the spaces between her hull and deck. Meanwhile, the young petty officer was photographing everything with a digital camera, documenting the inspection with the kind of thoroughness usually reserved for suspected smuggling operations. "Chief, the RBM is here," the petty officer announced as the second vessel pulled alongside. Sarah watched as 5 additional Coast Guard personnel transferred to her boat. Among them was a lieutenant commander, a woman in her early 40s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. She surveyed the scene quickly, then approached Sarah directly. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Patricia Wells," she said. "I understand we have some questions about this vessel." "Ma'am, I've been completely cooperative with your inspection," Sarah replied. "My paperwork is in order, my equipment meets all safety requirements, and I've been fishing in legal waters." "I'm sure you have," Wells replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "However, we've received information that suggests this vessel may have been involved in activities that warrant our attention." "What kind of activities?" Wells consulted a tablet that one of her crew handed her. "Reports indicate this boat was observed in restricted waters near a military facility 3 days ago. Additionally, someone noted unusual antenna configurations that might suggest surveillance equipment." Sarah's mind immediately went to work processing this information. 3 days ago, she had indeed been fishing, but nowhere near any military facility, and her antenna modifications were for better communication range, not surveillance. Someone had either made a mistake or was deliberately trying to cause trouble for her. "Lieutenant Commander, I can account for my whereabouts 3 days ago. I was fishing the reef line about 15 miles southeast of here. I have GPS logs that can verify my position." "We'll need to examine those logs," Wells replied. "In the meantime, I'm afraid we're going to need to escort your vessel to port for a more thorough investigation." This was exactly what Sarah had been afraid of. Once they took her boat to port, it could be impounded for days or weeks while they conducted their investigation. Even if she was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing, the process could destroy her peaceful retirement and possibly expose aspects of her past that she preferred to keep private. "Ma'am, with respect, I believe there's been some kind of mistake here," Sarah said. "Perhaps if you could tell me which military facility I'm supposed to have approached, I can provide evidence that I was nowhere near it." Wells hesitated for a moment, then checked her tablet again. Naval Air Station Key West. A security patrol reported a vessel matching this description conducting apparent surveillance activities near the base perimeter. Sarah almost laughed with relief. Lieutenant Commander, Naval Air Station Key West is over 30 miles from here. My boat's top speed is about 25 knots. There's no way I could have been fishing where I said I was and also been conducting surveillance at NAS Key West on the same day. The timing alone would be impossible. Wells frowned and looked at her tablet more carefully. According to this report, the incident occurred around 1400 hours. And I was back at the marina in Key Largo by 1500 hours that day with a boat full of fish. The harbor master saw me dock. And there are probably a dozen witnesses who saw me cleaning fish at the marina around that time. For the first time since this ordeal began, Sarah saw uncertainty creep into Wells' expression. She was clearly starting to realize that something didn't add up about the report they had received. But before Wells could respond, the chief petty officer called out from the cabin area. "Ma'am, I think you need to see this." He emerged from the small forward cabin, holding what appeared to be a waterproof case. Sarah's stomach dropped. She recognized the case immediately. It contained items from her military career that she had kept as mementos, including some things that might be difficult to explain to civilian law enforcement. "What's in the case?" Wells asked. "It's locked," the chief replied. "But it's the kind of case used for sensitive equipment or documents." Wells turned to Sarah. "I'm going to need you to open that case." Sarah hesitated. Inside the case were photographs, medals, and other personal items from her time in naval special warfare. There was nothing classified or illegal in there, but the contents would immediately reveal that her description of herself as a simple electronics technician was a significant understatement of her actual military service. "Ma'am, those are personal items," Sarah said carefully. "Military memorabilia from my service." "I understand, but given the circumstances, I need to verify that. Please open the case." Sarah realized she was at a crossroads. She could continue trying to maintain her cover story and hope they would eventually realize their mistake, or she could reveal enough of the truth to establish her credibility. Neither option was particularly appealing, but being arrested for something she didn't do was even less appealing. She took the case from the chief and set it on the boat's small table. The locks opened with 2 quick clicks, and she lifted the lid carefully, positioning herself so that she could control what the Coast Guard personnel could see. Inside, wrapped in protective plastic, were photographs from various deployments, several military decorations, and a few official documents that she had been allowed to keep upon retirement. She carefully removed one of the photographs, a group shot of her team standing in front of a military helicopter in what was obviously a desert environment. "I served in naval special warfare," she said quietly. "These are just personal photos and awards." Wells took the photograph and studied it carefully. In it, Sarah was wearing full combat gear, standing with 7 other heavily armed personnel in front of what was clearly a special operations helicopter. Her face was younger, but unmistakably her. "Naval special warfare," Wells repeated. "You mean SEALs?" "I was attached to SEAL teams for most of my operational career," Sarah confirmed, "but my actual rate was special warfare operator." The effect of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. The chief petty officer's expression changed completely, shifting from suspicion to something approaching respect. Even the younger Coast Guard personnel seemed to straighten up slightly. Wells continued examining the photograph. "This looks like Afghanistan or Iraq." "Both. Among other places," Sarah said. 12 years, multiple deployments." Wells carefully handed the photograph back to Sarah, then stepped away to confer quietly with the chief. Sarah could see them engaged in an intense discussion, with frequent glances in her direction. After several minutes, Wells returned. "Ms. Martinez, I need to ask you directly. Is there any reason why someone might want to make false reports about your activities? Sarah had been wondering the same thing. Not that I can think of. I keep to myself, mind my own business. I fish, I maintain my boat, and I don't bother anybody. Any issues with neighbors, former colleagues, anyone who might have a grudge? No, ma'am. Like I said, I keep a low profile. Wells nodded thoughtfully. Here's what I think happened. Someone saw your boat, noticed the antenna modifications, and jumped to conclusions. Maybe they thought you were drug smugglers or foreign agents conducting surveillance. When they called it in, they probably gave an approximate location rather than a precise one, and somehow Naval Air Station Key West got mentioned as the nearest military facility. That would explain the confusion about locations, Sarah agreed. The problem is, once a report like this gets into the system, we have to investigate it thoroughly. But given your background and the obvious inconsistencies in the report, I'm inclined to believe this is a case of mistaken identity or overzealous citizen reporting. Sarah felt a wave of relief, but she tried not to show it too obviously. So what happens now? We'll need to verify your story about your whereabouts 3 days ago, Wells said. But if your GPS logs and witnesses at the marina support your account, which I believe they will, then we'll close this investigation as unfounded. The chief approached and handed Wells a clipboard. Ma'am, I've completed the inspection. Everything on this vessel is legal and properly documented. The modifications to the radio equipment are within civilian regulations, and all safety equipment is current and functional. Wells signed the clipboard and handed it back. In that case, Ms. Martinez, you're free to go. We apologize for the inconvenience, and we appreciate your cooperation. But as the Coast Guard crew began preparing to leave her boat, Wells paused. Can I ask you something? After everything you did in the Navy, what made you decide to retire to fishing? Sarah looked out at the ocean, watching the late morning sun sparkle on the waves. After 12 years of being where people were trying to kill me, I wanted to go somewhere peaceful. The ocean is the most peaceful place I know. Wells nodded with understanding. I can see the appeal. Fair winds and following seas, petty officer. Thank you, ma'am. As the Coast Guard vessels pulled away, Sarah remained standing on her boat, watching them disappear toward the horizon. The morning's drama was over, but it had served as an unwelcome reminder that her past was never really as far behind her as she sometimes liked to think. She started her engine and began the trip back to port, but her mind was still processing what had just happened. Someone had reported her boat for suspicious activity. Whether it was an honest mistake or something more deliberate, she couldn't be sure. But the incident had forced her to reveal more about her background than she had wanted to, even to law enforcement. As the coastline of Florida grew larger ahead of her, Sarah made a mental note to be more careful about her profile in the community. Apparently, even in retirement, being a former special operations soldier came with complications she hadn't fully anticipated. 2 days later, Sarah was cleaning her boat at the marina when she noticed a familiar figure walking down the dock toward her slip. Lieutenant Commander Wells was wearing civilian clothes, khaki pants and a navy blue polo shirt, but her military bearing was unmistakable, even in casual attire. Ms. Martinez? Wells called out as she approached. I hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I wanted to follow up on our encounter the other day. Sarah straightened up from where she had been scrubbing the boat's hull. No problem at all, Lieutenant Commander. Everything okay? Call me Patty when I'm off duty, Wells said with a slight smile. And yes, everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. I wanted to let you know that we completed our investigation into the report about your boat. And? Completely unfounded, just as we suspected. Your GPS logs confirmed you were exactly where you said you were, the marina master corroborated your return time, and we even found 3 fishermen who saw you at the reef that day. Wells paused. But there's more to it than that. Sarah set down her cleaning supplies and gave Wells her full attention. What kind of more? We traced the source of the original report. It came from a man named Derek Castellanos. Ring any bells? The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't heard it in over 3 years, but she would never forget it. Derek Castellanos had been a military contractor in Afghanistan, working security for a private company that provided protection for civilian reconstruction projects. Their paths had crossed during a mission that had gone very badly wrong. "I know him," Sarah said quietly. "I thought you might. Turns out Mr. Castellanos has quite a history with federal law enforcement. 3 arrests for harassment, 2 restraining orders from different women, and a general pattern of behavior that suggests he has trouble letting go of perceived grudges. How did he even know I was here?" Wells pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a social media screenshot. "He's been tracking you online. This photo was posted by someone at the marina last week. Just a casual shot of boats in the harbor, but your boat is clearly visible in the background with the name on the stern." Sarah examined the image. It was indeed her boat, moored in its usual slip. Someone had posted it as part of a general beautiful day at the marina type of social media post, not realizing that they were inadvertently revealing her location to someone who had been looking for her. "So he saw this and decided to call in a false report?" "We think so. When we interviewed him yesterday, he claimed it was a case of mistaken identity and that he was just being a concerned citizen. But his story had more holes than a fishing net." Wells put her phone away. "The good news is that he's being charged with filing a false report and wasting Coast Guard resources. The bad news is that now you know he's found you." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. Derek Castellanos represented a chapter of her life that she had hoped was permanently closed. Their confrontation in Afghanistan had been both professional and personal, and it had ended with him being sent home in disgrace while she completed her mission successfully. "What exactly happened between you two?" Wells asked. "You don't have to answer if it's classified, but understanding the situation might help us determine if you need additional protection." Sarah looked out at the water, gathering her thoughts. The story wasn't classified, but it was complicated and involved aspects of her military service that she preferred not to discuss. "It was during a mission in Afghanistan about 4 years ago," she began. "Derek's security company was supposed to provide protection for a civilian engineering team that was rebuilding a bridge in a contested area. My team was tasked with reconnaissance and backup support." "What went wrong?" "Derek and his men were supposed to establish a security perimeter around the work site, but Derek had been drinking, which we didn't know at the time, and his judgment was impaired. When we detected enemy movement in the area, he insisted that his team could handle it and told us to stay back." Wells listened intently as Sarah continued. 3 of his contractors were killed in the ambush that followed. The engineering team barely escaped, and the bridge project was abandoned. Derek blamed my team for not providing adequate intelligence, but the truth was that his poor decision-making had gotten his own people killed. And that's when things got personal. During the after-action review, Derek accused me of deliberately withholding information that could have saved his men. He made some very ugly comments about women in combat roles and suggested that I was more interested in advancing my own career than protecting his team. How did you respond? Sarah allowed herself a small, grim smile. I provided detailed documentation of every warning we had given his team, along with radio transcripts that proved we had recommended they withdraw from the area. Derek's security clearance was revoked, his company lost their contract, and he was sent home the next day. And he's held a grudge ever since? Apparently so. I thought he had forgotten about it, or at least moved on with his life. But I guess some people don't know how to let go. Wells nodded thoughtfully. Unfortunately, this kind of thing isn't uncommon with former military contractors who had negative experiences overseas. They sometimes fixate on someone they blame for their problems, and it can become an obsession. So what happens now? Officially, we've closed our investigation, and Mr. Castellanos will face charges for filing the false report. Unofficially, I'd recommend that you take some precautions, change up your routines, maybe consider varying your fishing locations, and definitely be more careful about your online presence. Sarah appreciated the advice, but she had already been thinking along the same lines. Her special operations training had included extensive instruction on personal security and counter-surveillance techniques. She just hadn't expected to need those skills in retirement. There's something else, Wells added. During our investigation, we discovered that Derek has been researching you quite extensively. He knows where you live, where you dock your boat, and apparently he's been tracking your movements for several weeks. This was more disturbing than the false Coast Guard report. If Derek had been conducting surveillance on her, he knew far more about her current life than she was comfortable with. It also suggested that the boat report might have been just the beginning of a larger harassment campaign. Has he made any direct threats? Nothing explicit that would rise to the level of criminal charges, but his online activity suggests someone who's becoming increasingly fixated. Our recommendation is that you document everything. Any unusual activity around your home or boat, any strange phone calls, anyone who seems to be following you. And if he escalates beyond harassment? Wells's expression became serious. Then you call local law enforcement immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself, even with your background. The legal system works better when everything is properly documented. Sarah understood the advice, but she also knew that if Derek Castellanos decided to move beyond making false reports to the Coast Guard, she might not have the luxury of waiting for law enforcement to respond. Her special operations training had taught her to be prepared for threats, and this situation was starting to feel like a threat that was still developing. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said. "How did you know to dig deeper into this case? Most Coast Guard inspections wouldn't have involved this level of follow-up investigation." Wells smiled, because the story didn't make sense from the beginning. A former special operations soldier conducting surveillance on a military base with a fishing boat? Anyone with real military experience would know that was ridiculous. Plus, your reaction when we searched your boat told me everything I needed to know about your character. My reaction? You were concerned but not panicked. You cooperated fully but maintained your dignity. You answered our questions honestly, even when it meant revealing information you clearly preferred to keep private. That's not how guilty people behave. Sarah appreciated the assessment, but it also reminded her how much her military background had shaped her responses to stress and authority. Even in retirement, she apparently still acted like a soldier when the situation required it. "One more thing," Wells said. "I took the liberty of running Derek's information through some databases that the Coast Guard has access to. He's currently living in Miami, unemployed, and has been having significant financial problems since losing his security contractor job. People in that situation sometimes make desperate decisions." Meaning? Meaning this probably won't end with the false Coast Guard report. Men like Derek Castellanos don't usually give up after their first attempt fails. He'll likely try something else, and next time it might be more direct. Sarah nodded, absorbing this information. She had hoped that her retirement would be permanently peaceful, but apparently her past was not quite ready to let her go. Derek Castellanos represented unfinished business from a part of her life that she had tried to leave behind, and now that business was following her into her new civilian existence. "Thank you for the heads up," Sarah said, "and thank you for conducting a thorough investigation instead of just accepting the report at face value." "That's what we're supposed to do," Wells replied. "But I'll admit, your military record made me want to be extra sure we got it right. People who've served their country the way you have deserve better than to be harassed by someone with a personal grudge." As Wells walked back down the dock toward her car, Sarah returned to cleaning her boat, but her mind was now focused on security considerations rather than maintenance tasks. She would need to upgrade her home security system, vary her daily routines, and probably invest in some additional personal protection measures. Most importantly, she would need to decide whether to continue trying to maintain her low-profile retirement or to take more active steps to deal with the Derek Castellanos situation. Her special operations training had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, but her civilian instincts suggested that involving law enforcement was the smarter approach. As the sun set over the marina, Sarah realized that her peaceful retirement had just become significantly more complicated. But she had survived 12 years in some of the world's most dangerous places. She could certainly handle one vindictive former contractor who apparently didn't know when to quit. The question was whether Derek Castellanos was smart enough to learn that lesson before he found out exactly why the Coast Guard had gone rigid when they discovered who they were really dealing with.